Hi there, and welcome back to part 2 now of geochemical evidence for the origin of life. In part 1 of this series, you learned about how carbon isotopes might be a signal for life, and you also heard about the claim that 3.8 billion-year-old rocks from Greenland contain carbon with that negative isotope composition that might indicate the presence of life. Well, this video looks at the debate over that hypothesis and some of the evidence for and against it. One of the really crucial questions is whether the rocks are marine sediments. They're claimed to be 3.8 billion-year-old marine sediments, but metamorphosed at high temperature and pressure. But are they marine sediments if they really are banded iron formations? Well, banded iron formations are deposited on the seafloor from chemicals in the seawater, so if they really are, then there is a chance that chemical signals from life could be preserved in that type of rock. But if they aren't really banded iron formations, then we might be a little more skeptical about this claim that the isotopes tell us about life. Well, one way of testing whether they are banded iron formations is to compare the chemistry of the different rocks. There's lots of different things that can be measured, but one study looked at the amount of 3 different elements: chromium, or Cr, thorium, Th, and scandium, Sc. They looked at them in the supposed iron formation from Akilia Island in orange here. They looked at sort of well-accepted iron formations from Isua, also in Greenland, in the greenish color here. And they also looked at the ultramafic, the lavas from Akilia Island. Well, the ultramafic lavas on Akilia have lots more chromium than thorium, between 1,000 to nearly 10,000 times as much. In contrast, the iron formations from Isua have only a little over 100 times as much chromium as they do thorium. But they have more thorium relative to scandium. Thorium is about 0.1 times as abundant as scandium on average. But look at where the supposed banded iron formation from Akilia plot. Well, what conclusion could you make from this? Well, it seems that the chemical composition, at least for these 3 elements and this one sample, is different from the other iron formations and more similar to the lavas. But then why do they look so different just in color and appearance? Well, perhaps the iron formations aren't actually sedimentary rocks, but instead they're zones where hot fluids, like hot water, flowed through the rock, adding and removing and changing the chemistry and the minerals that are there. The technical name for this process is called metasomatism. Some elements are affected a lot by the fluid alteration, and some aren't really affected that much. That could be why the chromium and thorium are good markers of this process. But what would this mean for the carbon contained in the rock if these are just altered lavas? How could there be carbon in there at all? Well, it's possible that the breakdown of minerals in rocks could produce hydrogen and carbon, which could then be combined through chemical reactions called Fischer-Tropsch synthesis to produce organic compounds even without the presence of life. You've heard about this process before when we talked about the microfossils. But the key thing here is that Fischer-Tropsch synthesis might still result in fractionation, a change in the carbon isotopes, and it might be about the same size as the fractionation that you would get from living organisms changing carbon. So perhaps carbon isotope fractionation itself isn't a 100% certain sign of life. But you also might wonder if there isn't much evidence for these Fischer-Tropsch processes today in nature, why would we expect it to be so important in producing organic matter here in this situation? Well, the argument that the rocks were altered by water rather than being true iron formations was based on one sample, but the original scientists argued that that one sample as well wasn't even one of the ones that contained carbon. So they went back and measured a whole bunch more samples. Many of their samples, including ones with the carbon inclusions, actually ended up having compositions more similar to the Isua banded iron formations after all. And they got a little bit snippy in their rebuttal to the paper as well. Scientific papers are usually quite formal, so ouch with this statement here. But there's also another possible way to test whether the supposed iron formations are just altered lava rocks or whether they really are a different type of rock. If it's true that they're just altered, their chemistry should be intermediate between the original rock, the original lavas that haven't been altered, and the water that did the alterations. So obviously the water that did the altering is long gone now, but we can get close to it by measuring the minerals that formed from that water in irregular cracks and regions in the rock called veins. These veins are just a random picture. They're not actually from Akilia Island, but they give you an idea of what veins are. If the iron formations are just altered lava rocks, their chemistry should fall along a line between the original rock and the veins. Well, let's have a look using the same three elements as before. Here the purple squares again are the ultramafic, the lavas. The blue circles are these most altered samples that are thought to be most representative of what the water was like that did the alterations. And again, the possible banded iron formations are the orange squares. So do you think that this supports the alteration hypothesis? Do they fall along a line between the two or not? Well, the authors of this study argue that the chemistry does not fall along that expected mixing line, and so they felt that it was more consistent with the samples being different, being iron formations, and not just being altered lava rocks. We may also ask a different question. We might also want to know whether the carbon formed at the same time as the rock. For example, if the carbon happened to enter the rock at some unknown later time, it wouldn't provide evidence for life 3.8 billion years ago. But first, is there actually any carbon in the samples at all? A later study used a few different microscope techniques to reinvestigate the samples and said that they couldn't find any graphite, which is the carbon material, at all, including in one of the samples used in the original study. So this seems a bit strange, but also kind of a big deal if it's true. Is there really no carbon in here after all? Okay, false alarm. There is some carbon actually in the form of graphite, at least in some of the crystals. Crisis averted here. We can carry on. So that the group went back and looked in more detail and with 3D chemical imaging. And found that about 5 to 10% of the crystals do contain tiny inclusions of graphite, which does have the negative carbon isotope values that started the whole thing. They demonstrated this with Raman spectroscopy, which you've also heard about before, which shoots the lasers at the material and measures how the light indicates with the bond. And this technique revealed the two peaks in the spectrum indicative of graphite inside the tiny crystal of the mineral apatite. But this still doesn't answer whether the carbon formed at the same time as the mineral. And in fact, it looks like at least some of the graphite pieces are found in something called fluid inclusions. So fluid inclusions are little bubbles of water and gas. They might contain water or nitrogen, carbon dioxide, methane, so forth. And these little bubbles are trapped inside mineral crystals. Now that in itself is not such a big deal, because fluid inclusions can form as the crystal grows, trapping original seawater with them. However, these fluid inclusions occur as little chains of bubbles, which could be consistent with them forming along cracks later on, and sometimes these chains cut across multiple crystals. This kind of cross-cutting relationship, especially in the bottom left picture, where it cross-cuts the quartz and the little apatite crystal with the AP there. So that cross-cutting relationship is what you'd expect if the crystals existed first, and then the fluid inclusions came later as these little chains of bubbles and cut across them. Well, if that's the case for all of the graphite, then it might argue against the carbon coming from 3.8 billion year old life. So that's basically the end of this video. Thanks for listening. Do you think that the carbon from these 3.8 billion year old rocks in Greenland provides strong evidence for life? Were the rocks originally ocean sediments or banded iron formations? Well, perhaps. Did the carbon form at the same time as the rock, more than 3.8 billion years ago? Maybe, maybe not. What do you think about this?